Hello, everyone. Let me get started. So I'm doing a new series of videos that I'm calling Soul Mechanics. It's basically I want to walk through um, us. I want to walk through neuroscience papers that talk about things that are interesting to me. There's kind of an agenda to it. Let me see if I can summarize the agenda. There's a quote by, I believe, Don Ross that out of all the areas of neuroscience, if this is not exactly what he said, but this is kind of the takeaway I took from his discussion on it. Um, if you could understand two branches of neuroscience that could be framed as the branch of neuroscience underlying economic behavior and the branch of science underlying the way humans create narratives, then that would be a candidate for a theory of human being. Um, so this kind of idea is really interesting to me. So I wanted to. So the two areas of neuroscience that are most interesting to me are what is getting labeled these days as neurolinguistics and neuroeconomics. And especially interesting to me is the intersection between neurolinguistics and neuroeconomics, the integration between economic decision making um, and decision making generally, but especially social decision making, and the intersection of that with humans' situatedness in social situations, physical and social situations. So humans find themselves, they recognize themselves in certain situations in the world, and especially social situations, and they act within those situations towards all kinds of ends, not necessarily just maximizing their utility, but all kinds of social and moral ends that are getting mixed together, integrated with again economic decision making and in terms of a narrative. So a lot of social science, that would be the foundation for a lot of what people are looking at in social sciences and the humanities. This is the most interesting part of it's one of the most interesting studies for me. And yeah, so I wanted to walk through. So the way I want to approach these lectures is to be walking through kind of key papers, articles, and books on neurolinguistics and neuroeconomics, and think about you know how this advances us towards a grand theory of human being. When I mean a theory of human being, the parts that are relevant towards the things that social sciences and humanities looks at. So, not necessarily the theory of human circadian rhythms, sleep rhythms, or how the, autonomic system works. Those might come up, but the parts that I'm really interested in are things about like volitional action, free will, um, recognizing yourself in a social situation, and but most fundamentally, starting with economic decision making and action in an economic context, and neurolinguistics, language. Um, I think a lot of papers that I've selected, I think, have problems. They're papers or articles and books that give you a lot to discuss. Um, and for a lot of them, actually, I don't think they're very well grounded in the neuroscience, but they're really interesting to me. So I picked a lot of books and articles that actually want to reconstruct. I'll in the titles of them, the way I've structured what I want to talk about, I put it in terms of, reconstructing this idea in terms of neuroscience. So if we wanted to take this theory and operationalize it, how would neuroscience speak to this kind of idea? And again, the eye is towards, fundamental features of human action and language meanings that come up through language. So to start with, I picked this article, Angela Friederici's Brain Basis of Language from Structure to Function. There's a number of reasons why I chose this article to start with. It's a really great primer. It walks through all of this. It walks through the major systems of language. Although, as I'll get to later, I don't. It doesn't go through every single brain area that is involved in language. It's very, even at the very start, I have to, start with some qualifiers. There's a debate about what the fundamental elements of language are. And one way to frame a classic debate is classically, the study of language was very grammar focused, heavily grammar focused, as grammar is like the central end all be all of the study of language, and then the other things connect to that, like spokes, kind of traditional generative linguistics, formal linguistics programs, um, and that's opposed to more recent what get labeled as cognitive linguistics approaches, which are much more diverse in what they consider part of language studies. And part of that debate, which we'll get into, that this paper really jumps right into the middle of, is areas that what are the areas that are mediating language actually doing vis-a-vis, to what extent are they specialized to language, and to what extent are they integrated into kind of action generally. And as I was saying, like, some of my core interest is the integration of um, linguistics, uh, semantics, human meanings, and recognizing yourself in a social context, which comes through language, and human action. So that integration is exactly what's most interesting to me. So, uh, right. So this paper isn't exactly uh, friendly. How, I don't want to word it too strongly, but this isn't a paper that is necessarily in a line with the way I'm thinking about it. But I think it's actually really good. I'm picking papers actually that may be a little different, and I'm also looking at this paper because it's setting up as a foil towards more cognitive linguistics approaches that I want to look at after this. And this kind of sets, a foil, a kind of platform, which to raise a lot of those issues. Um, and like I said, even apart from that debate about the nature of language, this is just a really good paper that walks through major systems that are involved in language that you're going to have to look at no matter what. And if you had to pick one paper to do a kind of survey through that, no matter what's your philosophy on language, um, and even before you even get to the philosophical questions, there's certain areas you need to discuss, you need to talk about, and certain studies you'll need to deal with. This is a good survey paper for that. A kind of quick aside, just generally speaking of neuroscience papers, generally they tend to be really specialized, to the point of looking at really, sub areas of sub areas, working on really specific tasks. And you don't see survey articles too often. So for someone just starting, it's easy for them to get, kind of lost. Or they're not seeing the bird's eye view. They miss the forest for the trees. So this is a good kind of showing you the forest kind of paper. That's why I really like it. All right. Well, let me just start. So this first session, I just want to talk about some of the issues that interest me in looking at this paper. And then in the next ones, I'm going to actually start getting into the next episodes. I'm going to start actually getting into the paper itself. The way I kind of see these talks is, you of course can just get the paper and read it for yourself. I'm trying to add my commentary and thoughts on the different ideas that are being brought up. And another thing to note about this paper is, it doesn't say here, it's a rather old paper from 2011. So it's already, you could say, out of date. So, but it's still a good survey paper even with that. But there's a lot of times where I'll look at the questions that this part raised, what have been said about this, and what later studies kind of inform these, give us a better answer, which is kind of fun. It's fun to this is a way you can read older papers, is they pose questions, and then you can look at later studies and see how they can try to answer those questions. It's a kind of good exercise in understanding how science works generally, the way that data is collected, the kind of data you want to be looking for to answer the kind of questions that you can make progress, to give you some kind of handle on a model about what's going on. All right, so anyway, this is Angela Friederici, director of the Max Planck Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in Leipzig. There was a January 2022 article describing her as contrarian. That article is behind a paywall, so I was actually really interested in wanting to know what it says. So I had some of my own thoughts about why she might be called a contrarian that I'm going to get to. And it's already getting into what I was saying before, this debate generally that I'm really not giving justice to, but in the thumbnail version of it, the people that the formalists that think grammar is really the central part of the study of language, and neurolinguistics, that brain areas are very focused on specialized for formal grammar processing, versus the more cognitive linguistics approaches that take a more generic view of general cognitive processing on language issues and bootstrapping those. So one could argue that the kind of trend in neuroscience is on the cognitive linguistic side. It gets complicated because actually, if you read the topic called cognitive linguistics, it's surprisingly detached. They're surprisingly not in tune with what's happening in the neuroscience. And also, people studying language in neurosciences are surprisingly detached from anything being talked about in linguistics. So there's a lot of senses in which they're what you might call false debates, because things that people are saying in cognitive neurolinguistics are being framed in a different way as cognitive linguistics, which is being framed in a different way as generative linguistics. So there's a sense that they may be talking past each other, although they might see themselves as being contrarian to each other. So anyway, I interpreted this contrarian as she's kind of on the generative linguistic side of the spectrum. Well, she definitely is, for the reasons I'll mention in a minute. That's kind of against the flow of other people working in neurolinguistics, but they're not necessarily in opposition. And also, just generally, science is about developing models, and you want models to parsimoniously explain or organize the data you're finding, and you don't have to necessarily expect that the model answers some philosophical questions, because things can get tangled up. But anyway, we'll talk about what may be fair or unfair about calling her contrarian. And as we get into the details, this will make more sense. She wrote a book called Language in Our Brain, The Origins of a Uniquely Human Capacity. So you see right in the title, she's thinking about language she's thinking about the neural areas that mediate language as very specialized towards language functioning. Okay, so in opposition to the cognitive linguistics camp, some brands of it. This is the trailer for the little blurb for the book, A Comprehensive Account of the Neurobiological Basis of Language, arguing that species-specific brain differences may be at the root of the human capacity for language. So species-specific brain differences. Of course, if you're studying language, the very first thing you'll notice right up front is that other species don't have linguistic capacity. And so that's something to explain. So Chomsky wrote the preface to the book, and the book is apparently sympathetic to the arguments of innate and universal grammar that come. Chomsky's program today might be generally packaged as what they call generative grammar, um, where you're developing, and that's linguistics, the field of linguistics, where they're trying to, you know, uh, their models are rules of grammar, um, kind of organizing linguistics practice or capacity by rules of grammar. And one of their starting points is that there's an innate or universal grammar that all humans share, that comes from our genetic code and in early child development. Um, and this book is kind of sympathetic with that. This article, I haven't read the book yet, so I don't want to say too much about it. But definitely, this article here is that we're going to look at here talks about promotes a specialized system for language unique to humans. So I feel like going through this article, we get a good snapshot of that argument. But what's great about, like I said, this article is it's walking through a lot of the fundamental issues for language, and the major studies that anybody, trying to develop any model for language is going to have to contend with. Right. So, okay, which is what this says, a good snapshot of the basic points. So I'm adding a lot of my thoughts and commentary to the article. So in the slides, I'm adding it in blue text, when blue text is not specified for some other purpose. Right, so I don't want to just be giving the article just straight because you can read it for yourself, but I want to be giving kind of my thoughts, and again, how it contributes towards my bigger agenda of developing this general, theory of language and economic behavior, neurolinguistics and neuroeconomics. One way that I think about studying any, studying neuroscience, computational, there's different branches of, it's a very fragmented field. It's still a very young field, and people come at the study of the brain and cognition from different perspectives. The one that's really interesting to me are models that you can apply, that you can maybe operationalize. It goes from the kind of more abstract, which you might even call like philosophy of mind, and then high level operationalization, like at the level of, like we said, like I was saying, linguistics and economics, and psychology is kind of a mid-level model. And then at the very lower level of, psychophysics and microbiology. So the one that's really interesting to me is what might go under the name of computational neuroscience. So you're looking at, areas of the brain, but you're thinking about them in terms of manifesting algorithms that accomplish functions. But what's really interesting to me is taking the computational ideas and being able to, do simulations of them. And, there's a kind of fuzzy boundary between computational neuroscience, understanding how the brain accomplishes certain functions, and developing models, computer models to be, artificial intelligence models that can do increasingly human-like computations, which is different than the deep learning approach, which is supposed to, they say they use neural nets, but it's not actually very consonant towards the kind of models that computational neuroscience people are developing. But in that frame, this is kind of my frame for looking at any of these articles and books that we're going to be looking at. I want to be thinking about how would you operationalize this for a in a computer model, and with that in mind, once I've gone through a lot of the core books and articles that I want to walk through, I want to actually think about building a chatbot, computer simulation and artificial general intelligence agent, AGI agent, that can to get all the ideas that we're developing in one framework of, it's a kind of ideal project about how we'd make an AGI program that's manifesting the ideas we're looking at through these papers. And that's why I also talk a lot about reconstructing ideas. Like, how do we reconstruct some of the ideas? And by the word reconstruction, I mean, how do the brain areas that we're actually studying, that we studied from other articles, how they actually manifest this, phenomenon that it's looking at, and also how would we simulate this in a AGI system. So I want to think about, and one way to approach that is actually to think of the project of coding, a chat, something like a chatbot. I want to make an agent that can articulate language to the best I understand the models that we'll be looking at, but also economic behavior. So integrating volitional action and the elements that go into linguistic processing. So when we look at these books and articles, I'm going to be thinking about what does this contribute towards our later project of developing that kind of system. I like that kind of methodology for a couple of reasons. It forces you to, so like I said, we're going to, cognitive science is a very fragmented field, and they're working at different levels of grain. Thinking in terms of operationalization, how would you develop this in one? Do you think in terms of one core system? And when you're seeing new studies, to me, in my mind, it's great to have kind of your own system, and thinking about, well, how does this new information or this new phenomenon, how would that fit with the system? And you'll have to change things, and over time, it's a way of organizing, looking at these articles that forces you to really to integrate ideas across a lot of different sources. And the idea is the project itself is forcing you to organize this information coming from disparate sources, and you can think about it in terms of mutual restrictions. So when you find two ideas and they can't be consistent with each other, you kind of look at the writing on the wall and see, well, if you're actually operationalizing this, this is the best kind of model you could think of. And over so many different examples, as you integrate over looking at more and more data, reading more and more books and articles on it, the hope is that your model gets increasingly parsimonious to a lot of different sources, which will kind of give it power. It gives us a kind of generalization, an ability to generalize over a lot of different sources. The better you can generalize over a lot of different sources, the more confident you can feel in your thinking on a subject. So that's why I want to always use, have this kind of operational perspective. Okay. So again, this first article is kind of getting the bird's eye overview. So I put together four slides here talking about some issues and kind of the stakes going into this article that I want to look at. These kind of thoughts I gave, they're a bit off the cuff, or I should say, if I were gonna write a peer-reviewed article on it, I would probably be a lot more careful in the way I worded things, so they're not worded strictly necessarily as carefully as I would want. And in some cases, I think I might not even stand by some of these things. So, and generally speaking, a lot of the things I might be talking about, I don't necessarily want to be saying things that I commit to too hard. So a lot of them are just to kind of put ideas out on a table and have a discussion, that are good, ideas that are good for discussion, to kind of introduce the ideas. And especially this is just an introduction. So, all right. So why are we looking at neurolinguistics articles? And what are some of the central questions in the study of language itself? How specialized to language are brain areas that mediate language? what's really happening in the core areas we're going to look at. So at the beginning, a lot of this, like I was saying, this article is kind of, you know, similar to the really grammar heavy focused approach towards language, thinking about really core areas of language, which there's neuroanatomical, there's a basis in imaging studies for why the areas we're going to look at should be considered core areas of language because they activate together. Um, so I don't want to necessarily criticize that approach. Um, and especially, if you're studying language, you want to start with there's some core areas you're going to have to deal with however you look at it. But then, the really basic question, what functions are these areas really mediating? This is superior temporal gyrus and Broca's areas, which is inferior prefrontal cortex. Not only the question of what functions are they mediating, but before we even get to that, the question is the prior question of, is it proper to even, can we expect to even understand the functioning of these kinds of areas with the kind of models that are useful for humans? All right. So, but anyway, this is what we want to be looking at. We want to be looking at the areas that are activating when language processing is happening, and at the most basic level, ask what functions, what's the contribution of this processing towards the linguistic behavior that we see, and one key question that Friederici comes back to a lot is, are language areas functionally dedicated, or are they general cognitive mechanisms working on, linguistics, a language task that they kind of bootstrap up as language, but it's just, a kind of logical problem it's solving, which isn't really my key question that I'm really, I'm not really, the functional specificity of these areas towards language isn't something that I'm questioning too much. So why would you? Well, even backing up, why does this question matter? If whether language is functionally dedicated, what are the kind of the stakes, or what's the kind of more philosophical, or what's the value of understanding that? So more deeply, the debate is really, is language innate to humans, which gets into really, the most core debate about what is linguistic cognition processing at all, and how separate are humans and humanity from the other animals. How separate is linguistic behavior as a category of, cognition, compared to other animals or species, and what's the nature of the distinction? What makes human language human? As humans act through language to be human, what's the nature of that distinction? What's the nature of humanity? What's the nature of being human, acting through processing mechanisms, mechanisms that are instantiating or that are mediating linguistic behavior? What's the actual nature of that functioning and the nature of the distinction? So if you think about it, that kind of philosophical perspective, the question of the innateness of language is a really interesting one, because it also says things about, if you think in Darwinian terms about humans evolving, to have a position that language is innate is implying, the direct implication is that language, grammatical, the actual processes were selected by natural selection, and kind of integrated into DNA. And so there's a sense that, and then so it's like a kind of pre-existing platform. And that's a way of saying that, in a sense, some parts of humanity are kind of hardwired, um, which is a different perspective than general cognitive mechanisms. And humans just developed this kind of cultural, this practice that they've overlaid human behavior of language. And you could imagine timelines, parallel timelines, where humans didn't develop language with the same architecture that they have. Okay. So one of the theses, so we're going to get into these kind of philosophical questions. That's kind of the stakes, and what's interesting about asking questions like that. More to the point, though, I'm just really interested in the model of what language actually is. So that's why I care a lot about it. I just want to know how these brain areas like Broca's area and temporal gyrus, what they're actually doing. And this is like a bonus, these kind of philosophical questions. And then also I said I want to take the perspective of computational neuroscience. So we're talking about the connection between structure and function. So one of the fundamental, this is another reason why I really like this paper. So one of the, because I like this approach to studying the mind, which is that structure and function have, structure informs function and function informs structure. So as you can see, these kind of brain maps, they have a structure of networking, and then consistent functioning happening in certain areas. And there are structural features, which we can get into more, but the actual organization of certain, neurological structures. So, for example, the way that the cortex is layered, or the connections between areas, the kinds of neuroreceptors, the kinds of receptors, binding receptors that have activation, these kind of structural elements. There's so computational neuroscience, one of the principles of that is that these structural elements can inform you about the actual functioning that's happening. And then you can do other studies, like behavioral studies. We're actually going to look down here, the kind of studies we're going to look at: imaging studies, lesion studies, and you can see how that impacts behavior, which gives you kind of insight into the steps of functioning for a process. And that can also tell you what to look for when you're looking in the areas, what kinds of structural differences you want to look for. So structure informs function. The kind of assumption, or the kind of framework underneath even asking that question, is the framework of computational neuroscience. There's different approaches, but David Marr, was one of the forefathers of computational neuroscience, and he had this idea of a three-level approach towards understanding the function of neural areas. The three levels: at the top level, you have, you think about this area in terms of the ultimate function it's trying to accomplish. Marr was looking at visual cortex, which is in the very back of the brain, structures mediating that kind of processing. And so in his famous book on vision, he took this three-level approach, which was very different. Before Marr, the classic approach to neuroscience was what we'll call the kind of associationist model, Sherringtonian framework. So Sherrington had this model also associated with behaviorism, associated with the classic, the way of the psychology of Wilson, really stimulus response, and Pavlov even before then. That classic model is you have efferent pathways, afferent pathways. So afferent pathways are you have the sense organs that are collecting data from the world, and they go up afferent pathways up into, upstream into the brain, and then we can see from the muscles you can follow pathways that are coming downstream, which are the muscle commands. And in between, so when they're looking at the brain, they can understand certain areas are affective, doing affective processing. They're getting sense data, so evidently they're processing the sense data and making predictions about what the world, understanding the stimulus. They're receiving and processing the stimulus. And then we can see efferent pathways coming down, the kind of like last common path, the kind of like essentially the path of no return when this signal is going to eventually turn into muscle commands. These efferent pathways are the response. And then they found these other areas which are somewhere in between, and they call this association cortex. And in these classic models, it was a kind of empty. It's the way you look at deep learning models. They start from de novo, and you just have a stimulus come in, and then it's just connected to a response, and you reweight the system. And in the 1940s you had models like the Hebbian model of a neural net, which is just you have a network of connected nodes, and the edges have weights on them. You put in a stimulus and you get a response, and then you mismatch it, the mismatch to the response you want to get. You reweight all the edges so that when the signal comes through again, you're going to get the response you want. So that kind of way of looking at it is function is just it's not really a functional perspective. You're just looking at pure structure. So that was the innovation of Mara's approach, and that's kind of the starting point for a computational neuroscience program, where you're not just looking at when you're looking at a brain area, you're not just looking at pure structure. That's just process. You're not just looking at pure structure processing a signal. You're thinking about it in terms of what's the actual function that this is performing for the agent. In terms of vision, what's isolating visual features from an object that hits the retina. That's a function. And then so that's the top level, what's the function it's performing. And then the mid level is what are the algorithmic steps that you need to take to perform that function. So we have some ultimate function like isolating visual features like contours and edges and shading from visual features. What are the algorithmic steps if you have a signal coming in, a certain data? What are the algorithmic steps you need to do? You need to process through that. And then the third level is the anatomical level. When you look at a brain area, so this is the sense in which I'm saying structure and function are mutually informing each other. If you have a picture of the functional steps that any computational system must go through to accomplish this, then you're going to look at the structure in terms of how is this going to manifest. We know that this is the kind of algorithm any system like this would have to do. You're going to be looking at the structure in terms of like how is this structure manifesting some algorithm that's accomplishing the function. And then when you're looking at a brain area, it gives you a structure. You can also have the structure inform the function, where you can think about, okay, this seems to be performing this kind of algorithm, instantiating this kind of algorithm, the way that this structure appears. What does that tell us about the function that it's mediating? Okay, so that's the neuroscience program, the computational neuroscience program. Structure comes from, and also where do these, how are you informed about these things? Structure comes from natural selection. Natural selection gives you a kind of baseline, like an out-of-the-box structure for the brain, but as soon as data starts coming in, I think I even have a picture here later we'll look at, yeah, this is a 7-year-old. This is a kind of pathway from a 7-year-old child to adults, and you can see immediately things have changed. So structure comes from natural selection, the out-of-the-box brain, but as soon as you have data coming in, the brain is also very plastic, and especially in early child development, things are started going to get rewired according to data coming in. In the nature-nurture debate, the apparent winner seems to be they're so integrated you can't disentangle them. So the computational neuroscience is also looking at where does the structure come from, and that can also help us inform the function. And we see themes across areas. So this is maybe another difference towards the classic way of looking at neuroscience, but in the computational neuroscience approach, you can see the writing on the wall for functions. So it turns out that a lot of different cognitive systems use very similar approaches, but it's complicated. Maybe we should start with first of all with saying that neuroscience is part of biology, and biology doesn't really have hard rules. Like, it's not mathematical rules. There are lots of exceptions, but there are themes across different areas. You shouldn't expect different areas that are going to mediate things exactly the same process, exactly the same way, but there are consistent themes. So, for example, speaking of incoming data information from the world, the brain, the first processing of sensory data coming in, we say that it doesn't do like an absolute signal. So when you're seeing like the brightness or the color of objects, a common theme is that there'll be a kind of baseline that the brain will set, and then new data will come in that will vary the baseline. So so in terms of like the brightness of an object, when you first walk into a room, it's a bigger relative brightness to the dark area you're coming out from, and then it renormalizes. And then if you go to an even brighter area, the brightness is a function, of where the baseline that was reset. So it throws out. So there are gobs of data that it just throws out immediately, because all these kinds of systems need is just the relative difference of the new information to the past information. So you don't need the absolute value of the color. You just need to know, how does the color vary from the color that you see now? And that variance signal, it's going to be, it's a kind of efficient way. And you can re-baseline. The whole concept of baselining, the brain likes to normalize and set baselines and normalize. You have a whole collection of a lot of different sensory data or objects in the world, and it will normalize processing of that across the whole field. That's a kind of thematic theme that you're going to see across a lot of areas. And then also, speaking of mismatch, another common theme which is going to be really important for the stakes that the issues that we're going to be talking about for this paper and in language, which is bootstrapping. So it turns out that bootstrap learning is a really common theme across a lot of cognitive areas. So bootstrap cognition. There was a video by Johan and friends a few weeks ago saying they went through Grossberg's work. Grossberg is a neuroscience scientist from Boston, I believe. I looked at it. I later went to go through Frank Gunther's work, who looked at the bootstrapping of the mechanical side of language, so the directing articulatory muscles to actually perform speech. That has a bootstrapping approach, and the kind of theme is, again, mismatching. You have a system that makes a prediction. You have some kind of action directing system that has an expectation of the result that's going to happen in the world. So in terms of language, the articulatory muscles, the sequence of actions to articulate a certain thing, and then it'll send a feed forward signal of the expectation of the sound it's going to get back once those things, uh, once that set of instructions is instantiated. And then you actually instantiate it, and you get a feedback signal, which is the actual sound you hear. And in early child development, there will be a mismatch between the expectation feed forward signal and the feedback signal, and the system will retool the instantiation based on that mismatch. That's a bootstrapping approach, and you see this bootstrapping approach. It's a common theme in a lot of different areas, and we're going to talk about it with language. So anyway, this is kind of the computational neuroscience approach. It's not in a vacuum when you're looking at brain areas. You can see the writing on the wall when you see a common theme that's in a lot of different brain areas. And that's another really valuable way. That's why I think doing neuroscience is, if you wanted to study economic behavior and linguistic behavior, there's a lot of different approaches. So I want to be advocating for what's the value of a neuroscience approach. And in some senses, it's like, the chemistry physics debate. Chemistry can be really useful for your purposes in using all kinds of materials. But if there's, if you want to have a deep understanding, if you have a chemistry model and a physics model, the physics model is going to be the more foundational one. And if there's something inconsistent between the physics model and the chemistry model, the physics model is going to win. So I think about that in terms of like social sciences and humanities and the neuroscience. The neuroscience gets kind of the last say about how the foundations and the limitations. So there's going to be certain things that linguistics and economists, the people making the theory, will say, and to the extent those would be incompatible with what we see in the neuroscience is going to win. But the problem is a lot of the people doing the neuroscience aren't really well versed in the higher level theory of economics and linguistics, so they're not asking the really right questions for the two fields to speak to each other. But we'll need to reconstruct economics and linguistics by these themes. That's what I like about computational neuroscience, is it gives you the most foundational perspective on these different, human capabilities. And part of that is you can look at things like natural selection, you can look at cross-species studies, and you can look at these common themes that you're seeing in a lot of different areas, and it'll give you an insight into how language and economic behavior and other forms of human behavior work. It gives you a special kind of insight that you can't get through any other route of exploration, at least not easily. And it's the most straightforward. The themes will just pop right out when you're looking at a lot of different areas. So that's what I like about this approach. There's some issues with, again, biology, for every rule you want to make, there's exceptions, or you always have to make caveats everything you say. A structure and functional, structure informs function, function informs structure. There's some issues even with that starting point. First of all, the way the brain is organized might not line up to the functions that we're thinking about. And this could also, just generally be the problem of confirmation bias. We may have a certain, like we said, we're looking at Mars 3 levels. If you have a really clear conception in your mind about algorithmic, ways that functions have to be performed, that could be a confirmation bias. When you're looking at the structure, you're only seeing the structure, the whole thing, like everything to it, everything to a hammer looks like a nail. So you can look at structure and be thinking about it only in terms of the functions that you have in your mind, which is a kind of confirmation bias. I put an X by Frege. So classically, another thing that's very interesting to note is neuroscience has kind of generations. So in the post-80s generation, which is also going to be part of this debate I was talking about, with the difference between the Chomsky-inspired formalists and the cognitive neuroscience, which are more integratory. Well, I'll have to explain what that means more. But classically, approaches towards psychology were very, very formalist. And kind of at the root of that entire approach would be Frege. So Frege was a logician at the late 19th century, and he was famously anti. He was trying to understand like universal rules of logic and thought at the most kind of abstract level, and he was explicitly anti-psychological in terms of explicitly not how the brain does it, but how any system would do it. Of course, the framework that he started would get later developed in what we consider now like computer science. Um, very, uh, very paradigmatic of this approach is like set theory. You understand set theory and truth values. You understand categories of objects in terms of the sets that they. If you want to understand the relationship between objects, you can ask what are the features they have, and then you can make a set out of shared features. And once you have sets, you can map objects from one set to another, and those are functions. And then you can make truth claims about. All truth claims can be framed in terms of the claims ultimately about what sets does the object fall into, and for every claim you can make, you can see if it's in a set or not, and it's true or false. This is a really formalist approach, and it has a power because you can use logical tools like if A then B is the same thing, not B or A. Or modus tollens, if A then B, A then B. Modus tollens, one of the most core logical rules, rules of implication. You can use these rules, but they're not necessarily how the brain does things. But the point is early neuroscience work was heavily influenced by a kind of Fregean approach. And at the most extreme, you had, like I said, the stimulus response. You didn't even think about what the brain was doing. You just framed everything in terms of functions going into, a kind of just pure sets about what responses are logically correlated to what stimulus. And the whole brain was just a black box that was just a grand function mapping stimulus to response, just pure mapping. And that idea was if you could do a perfect mapping of every stimulus to every possible kind of stimulus to every possible kind of response, then you're going to recreate the entire brain logically. That kind of bias is still around. And so famously, since we're talking about linguistics is still colored by this really logical approach. So we have what's called predicative calculus, and that's maybe the most famous innovation of Frege, is coming up with predicate calculus, which is applying a feature to an object by putting it into a set, and the set of all objects that are green, or the set of and then making logical inferences about if you have all men are mortal, so the set of all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. You can put that in a predicative calculus form, and you can get the answer. And of course, again, this is like the core of artificial intelligence, is this kind of inference machines. So it's, again, really anti-psychological, but language is really built on this. So then that brings us back to the whole punchline of this whole detour, which is if you're looking at structure, trying to understand how it instantiates function, if your mindset is in the Fregean framework, then you're going to be looking at structure in terms of the kind of formal properties that it's instantiating. So one of the books that I want to look at directly after this one, which may be a foil, this may be a foil setting up for that, which is, and that's Ryder Bogdan's Predicative Thinking. So we're going to directly address head on this issue, this possible difference between a Fregean approach towards semantics and grammar and the way the brain might instantiate it. And this paper, like we said, it takes a really Chomskyan perspective, and Chomsky, he's a formalist, generally, and the generative grammatical program, and that's still prevalent in linguistics, is a kind of formalist approach. Okay. Modularity. So we don't necessarily have to assume, we can't assume that the structures are going to instantiate the functions that we're thinking about. And then also, just before that is a bedrock idea in neuroscience that brain areas instantiate functions are kind of modularized, so that local areas, local regions in the brain work together in a relatively self-contained modular processing. So this is very different than that, stimulus response machine. And that association cortex was just de novo. It was just a clear slate, and the entire brain was undifferentiated. So now the modern approach is that the brain is modular. It's this kind of map, with different numbered areas, and the massive modularity thesis, which was, I think that thesis got named by Fodor, which was a theorist in the 1980s, the massive modularity thesis, that all the functioning of the brain is mediated by modular pieces that do relatively self-contained processing and then are networked to each other. And there's reasons why that's... lots of studies have reaffirmed many elements of modularity. Language was one of the original foundations for the modular thesis, and lesion studies. So people would have really discrete areas of their brain that would be lesioned, that got a hole in them. Like, for example, during wars, when people would get shot in the head, which would leave a really localized lesion. And they would see really specific functional breakdowns based on the area. Okay, so we have the idea that the brain is functionally, brain regions are functionally self-contained, and that's why this sentence says, but we can't necessarily assume that even if we think about them as functionally self-contained, that doesn't necessarily mean we understand what function it's self-containing. And that's this, when you look at a lesion study and you say, well, the hole is there, so this must be performing that function that's breaking down. Or you look at people doing a task. People do a task while they're in an fMRI machine that's doing imaging of, it's called a bold signal, blood flow. So the more heavily processing, the more an area's the more cells in an area are doing, the work of firing action potentials, which is the core work of the mediating cognitive processing. The more blood it uptakes, and the fMRI scan can get resonant, it can actually put a signal and highlight those areas of blood flow. So you can get visibility in certain tasks that really specific regions are getting relatively more highlighted, more activity, but that's not necessarily the final answer for what function that area is doing that function, at least in the way that you're thinking. But it is an entryway to the path to some answers, so it's informing us about something. And I wrote here, cross-reference the dopaminergic systems in neuroeconomics. It's because I had just read an article or a chapter in a book. In that chapter, it was dopamine was mediating bootstrap learning. Again, it's part of dopamine is associated with surprise. When you have we were talking earlier, a feed forward signal about an expectation, and then events happen in the world, and you could be surprised that it doesn't match your expectation, and you can feel that feeling of surprise, and maybe your attention spikes up. Dopamine is often associated with that. So that plays a key role in some neuroeconomic models. But the point of this chapter is you have to be careful, because there are dopaminergic systems. There are systems that use dopamine as a receptor that are doing other jobs. And even worse, there seem to be systems that do this mismatch processing that don't use dopamine. So if you had a simple model that dopaminergic systems are mediating this bootstrap, the Pavlovian kind of response. You hear a bell and the dog starts salivating. That dopamine is at the bottom of those kinds of processing. If you had a simple model like that, biology always wants to laugh at you, because dopamine, the systems you thought were mediating that are doing other things, and also things that don't use dopamine are also part of that processing. That's kind of we talk about a lot of studies in neuroscience. The theory of a good experiment to tease apart a hypothesis in neuroscience kind of turns on this way of thinking. So we often talk about what's called double dissociation, which is you have a neuroanatomical region, or you think it's doing a certain kind of processing, and then you have a task kind of processing. A double dissociation would be if you take away one, you lose the other, going in both directions. So an if and only if kind of situation. So where, A if and only if B, B if and only if A. So if you took away the region, then they couldn't perform that task. And if they can't perform the task, then it's only because they've lost this region. That's a double dissociation. It fails if you get a single dissociation, then it gets more complicated. That's where some people that lose this area can still perform the function, and or vice versa. People can lose the area and not do the function. So that's one direction. But there's some people that lose the function, but still have the area. So it's not double dissociative, it's just single dissociative. And then vice versa, which I'm already getting myself confused. I think I'd have to write this down on a piece of paper. But you can imagine. They lose the function, and they don't have the area, but other people have lost the area, but they can do the function. So that's in the opposite direction. That's kind of like this. That's an example of what that dopaminergic example from that book is talking about single dissociation. The whole point is neuroscience is hard. You can make experiments that you can't easily isolate function and structure. You can find things that are very suggestive. There's definitely, like, this area is definitely involved, but there's complications which suggests that you don't see the full picture. But you're always paranoid, because neuroscience, the brain is so complex with so many different interconnections. You should be constantly paranoid that even when you find a double dissociation, you should be really paranoid that you don't really understand the link between the structure and the function. So that's a problem we come back to a lot. And then again, goes back to the confirmation bias. You might have a model that has a linking structure and function that may work for the the fMRI data that you have. It may fit the data really well, but this kind of gets into the question of what is a science model anyway. A useful science model, for most human purposes, is it explains the data. You have, at the most kind of pragmatic level, the model is a mnemonic to just remember what the data you got is, and that's a useful model compared to nothing. But that's not necessarily giving you deeper insight Um, Neuroscience works at a lot of different levels, and it can often happen where you have deeper insight at certain levels and not other levels. Okay, so this is just kind of a challenge of the field. Um, okay, but anyway, so in this paper, we're going to be asking questions like, what does Broca's area do? Figuring out Broca's area as a task doesn't guarantee us to give us answers that we want or can use, and it can even framing it as what's the function of Broca's area can be misleading. Even to frame the question, Broca's area has to mediate some function, can put you on a misleading path to begin with. But what are we even looking for then? So we can still allow that structure and function inform each other. We're making progress when we're linking. That's the whole point of this exercise. We're still making progress, looking at the interrelationships between structure and function. But we need to look at the systems in context, and it tends to work. What's really valuable is looking at the same task or the same function from as many different perspectives as you can, because the different perspectives will mutually constrain each other, and the more constraints you can put into your testing, the better, the more confident you can be on the link between structure and function. So there's lots of different perspectives. That's another great thing about why I like neuroscience. You can look at it from an evolutionary perspective at the level of the DNA and child development, neonatal development or prenatal development, the development of the infant's brain, by the DNA, and also looking back in evolutionary history, which is this cross-species studies. How do other species, they may have brain areas it's not exactly the same. The term they use is homologs. What did these brain areas do? Often their functions will be different, but different in really suggestive ways about how this brain area in humans evolved, why it evolved in this path. The kind of evolutionary path can be really enlightening to the why it functions, how it functions. Ethology, that's just looking at the the phenomenology and the behavior of different species. You have to understand mouse psychology from the perspective of a mouse's world perspective. That's ethology. Different modalities. Okay, not in a vacuum. You can't just say the word massive modularity and think you've made modular consideration of its function airtight. And then you have these, this is kind of a modern, so Fodor in the 1980s came up with this perspective of massive modularity, which seemed to be reaffirmed. First of all, in the next session, I'm actually going to talk about Brodmann, who actually did a structural breakdown, a map of the brain, which is really suggestive. And that was in the mid-19th century already, that different brain areas mediated different functions. So kind of a modern trend of contemporary neuroscience. So these are just two people I picked out, Morosella and Ramachandran. They talk about you can't be so modularist. Anyway, they'll point out, I don't know about exceptions, but complications to the simple modular story. And sometimes they use this term networked modularity in stream models, where the functioning isn't as self-contained, but there's streams of information. Modular areas can processing that happens in a brain region can be sent upstream and downstream, and there's parallel streams that can happen where they're mutually constraining each other, and that's going to happen. Actually, stream models are going to be really important for language processing, and especially models where it's not clear if something's upstream or downstream, or when you have cases of maybe what you might call heterarchical streams. Heterarchical means in certain task situations this stream will have the priority and be sitting downstream towards later dependent stream, just dependent modules. But in other tasks, it can flip around. Like bottom up and top down processing is often considered like hierarchical. Sometimes some image that you see in your eye can inform your idea about what you're looking at, but that's bottom up constraint. But you can also have an idea about what you might be looking at that can actually change the shape of something in your stream. That's top down constraints, and those can be both happening in parallel. Morosella talks about consciousness as a function itself is mediating cross modality sensor. You have okay, so massive modularity would mean classical massive modularity thesis would mean visual processing is you have responses, human behavior responding to visual sensory data that's self-contained. You don't need consciousness for that. So that's things like binocular vision, where you have two images and they're reconciled into one image. So you know that when you cross your eyes, but sometimes you're in a situation where your eyes naturally cross and it takes it for a second. That's not a conscious, that happens unconsciously because it doesn't need any other modality, sensory modality. Everything can be just used using visual processing. So according to Morosella, what consciousness is really for is when you have certain tasks that have to align acoustic with somatosensory with visual information, and but the point is that kind of processing isn't modular, it's cross-modular. So you have certain kinds of systems where you have networked modularity, and Ramachandran, he loves cases where modularity is broken, and you get really unintuitive. The idea of like ghost limbs. That's the experiment he always likes to tell. Someone had a ghost limb where their hand was in a fist, and they just wanted to relieve that pressure. So in the experiment that he was looking at, that he was considering, I think someone else did the experiment. There's or maybe his lab did it. You just have a mirror, and then you use your other hand to open up the hand, and psychologically there's some linkage that's going to relieve the ghost hand's pressure. So for him, that was an example of this kind of networked modularity of processing that's crossing modulars. It's bringing in modulars from different areas, and it's not really self-contained in stream models. So this is a kind of modern way of approaching. So this is a complication. All of this is a complication towards this idea of structure and function. The question of structure to function is a really complicated one, and we need to keep in mind these kinds of bigger frameworks. And anyway, we just need to keep in mind the caveats and complications, but we can still looking at the linkage is still informative to us. All right, let me stop there, and I will come back for these other slides. I've already done episode 2, part 2, so this will be part 1, and next time I'll do part 2, part 1, part 2. But let me stop there, and I'll come back to continuing the preface in my next session. Thanks everyone. Bye.